I beg to ask the Chief Minister if he will make a statement about the recent floods and what plans he has for future flood prevention in Laxey.
Following the Chief Minister, Honourable Member for Middle, Mr Quayle.
Thank you, Mr President, and can I first clarify, whilst you very graciously gave me leave of absence, my meeting has been cancelled and I'm delighted that I can spend all the time with this Honourable Court. Mr President, can I first and foremost say that my heart goes out to the people in Laxey affected by the flooding last week. I visited the village on Wednesday and I saw firsthand the devastation caused to people's beloved homes. I have written to those people who allowed me into their devastated homes to thank them for allowing me to witness the damage in traumatic circumstances whilst giving me a warm welcome. I also wanted to pay tribute to everyone involved in the emergency response to the major incident on Tuesday morning. I think honourable members will agree with me that the swift and capable response from the emergency services, Department of Infrastructure, Department of Health and Social Care, Manx utility workers and Garth commissioners, along with volunteers from Civil Defence, the Coast Guard, St John's Ambulance, Police and many, many more, were outstanding. I was proud of the community response to the flooding, whether it was the offers of assistance from individuals and businesses to those affected, donations to the hardship fund set up by Onken Rotary Club, or providing food and drink to our emergency workers in such dreadful conditions. I saw a comment on social media, which I don't normally follow, of someone describing the island's response to emergencies like this as the island at its best. Mr President, I wholeheartedly agree. The response to the flooding is now in the clean-up stage. Debris has been removed from the river above the old MER weir, and the large concrete plinths on the weir have been removed by Manx Utilities. Breaches in the wall alongside the river have been shored up with temporary barriers by the DOI and Manx Utilities, and the Civil Defence has visited the site and spent time helping people clear out their damaged goods, as well as laying sandbags. DEFA, DOI and Manx Utilities teams continue to clear streams and tributaries in the surrounding area to remove any other debris brought down by the flooding. A community liaison officer has been appointed to visit affected residents, offer reassurance and to act as a point of contact with government, as well as signposting people to other agencies for help. Rainfall levels experienced overnight on Monday the 30th September in the Laxey area were higher than predicted, with exceptional rainfall at 8 p.m. on the 30th and at 6 a.m. the following morning, the 1st of October. It is likely to be confirmed as the highest rainfall recorded at sea level since records began in 1945. Rainfall on the upper parts of the Laxey River catchment reached 107 millimetres compared to the 78 millimetres in the 2015 flood. Mr President, I called a meeting on the afternoon of Wednesday the 2nd of October with the Ministers of the Environment, Food and Agriculture, Infrastructure and Treasury, with the Chair of the Manx Utilities and senior officers. I have directed that all agencies take prompt, short-term remedial action. The relevant agencies are also developing a longer-term plan for action as follows. A specialist consultancy has been appointed by Manx Utilities to advise on immediate action that can be taken in the river, as well as to review the long-term management of the entire catchment. And I was pleased to hear this morning that they have arrived on the island and are beginning their work today. The results will be used to identify river and river catchment solutions and to improve the design of the DOI's proposed climate change mitigation scheme for Laxey Harbour. A number of solutions to deal with heavy rainfall by adding permanent new infrastructure in the village will be examined, and all practical ideas shared with local people to ensure they are happy with any structural changes that might be made. As intensive rainfall of this sort is to be expected to be more frequent in the future, the DOI, Manx Utilities and DEFA will continue to work together within the Environment and Infrastructure Subcommittee of the Council of Ministers to reduce the risk of flooding in the old Laxey area. In addition, a review of the legislation covering flooding has been undertaken to identify ways in which land and river owners could be obliged to keep rivers and banks clear. Finally, honourable members, I can announce this morning that I have instructed the Chief Secretary to establish an independent review into the flooding in Laxey. This will be undertaken by a relevant expert appointed from outside government who will have the remit to independently review what happened last week and what needs to be done to protect the village from the threat of flooding in the future. Mr. President, I have requested that the establishment of this review is dealt with as a matter of urgency, and I will be happy to update honourable members on the appointment of the independent person and the terms of reference for the review once these have been actioned. Flooding will always be a risk, but we will take action to mitigate the risk and the impact as far as possible.
Supplementary, Mr. Perkins.
I thank the Chief Minister for that information, and I'm heartened to hear that finally the message is starting to get through. We, in 2013, passed new legislation for this very purpose. What has happened since 2013? Would the Chief Minister agree that too little has been done too late, and we really need to focus on this issue? We lost the bridge, and we very nearly lost a bus full of children back in 2015 when we had the last floods. The episode last week, we very nearly lost lives. We have missed 2 bullets that have been fired by global warming, and it is essential that we address this and leave no stone unturned in taking it forward. Would the Chief Minister agree that we have done too little too late?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, obviously I'll be asking for an independent review to look into all those areas and report back to us all. But if I can give the honourable member an update on what's been done since this event, and then I'll discuss the government work on flood management risks going back a number of years. So since the flood, we have had areas of failed river wall have had temporary flood barriers installed. The weir has been cleared of trees, stones and concrete, and all over 600 tonnes was taken out of the river. The 2 concrete structures on the weir that helped to cause dams to form have been removed. A mini digger and driver has been put at the disposal of affected residents for help with the clean-up. 40 to 50 pallets of sandbags were placed in the area for use by residents. Manpower has been deployed to assist in the clean-up. Chainsaw operatives from the DEFA, MUA and DOI have been deployed in the river and in the glen to cut up fallen or dying trees and branches. The replacement Glen Road wall design has been completed. The waterfall culvert redesign is underway and the initial safeguarding has been undertaken. A specialist consultancy has been engaged to identify priority areas in the river for maintenance. 120 tote bags of sand have been deployed on site to help protect residents in the short term. All gullies have been inspected and cleared, and it's fair to say that that work had been done the week before by the commissioners. And we have people on community service were deployed filling sandbags on Saturday. A structural inspection has been made of the Swales Bridge. A structural inspection has been made of the private dam above Agnish, and around 20 skips have been provided for flood-damaged materials. Now, obviously, there are a number of reports stating that action should have been taken, and the DEFA, DOI and MUA have worked together during 2015-16 to establish the National Strategy on Flooding, Sea Defences and Coastal Erosion, which was approved by Tynwald in July 2016. The strategy modelled the impact of coastal erosion and climate change for the next century and identified the top 100 risk areas which will need to be addressed during the century. This administration committed during the current administration to address the 24 highest risk matters which with that work has been identified. A working group of DOI, DEFA and MUA officers steer the work to address those highest risk areas and report regularly to the Council of Ministers. Good progress has been achieved with improvements to the harbour infrastructure and coastal erosion work, and there is now an increasing focus on the high-risk river catchments. The Laxey catchment is number 12 on that list, and the work to prepare a catchment management plan is now being accelerated. Work already undertaken includes the Castletown Sea Defence and Port St Mary. But obviously we will be reviewing what has happened since the last flooding to see if more could have been done.
Honourable Member for Garth, Mr Perkins.
I thank the Chief Minister for that. Is the Chief Minister aware that the feeling in Laxey is anger and it's fright? People are very worried that this, no matter all the platitudes we hear, all the reports we have, all the people looking into it, it's not being, the locals aren't being taken notice of simple basic things. So we have the Commissioner's clerks giving notice to the 3 departments being passed around from one to the other of a severe blockage in the Glenroy tributary. The department came down, sprayed it with red paint, despite the Commissioners saying it will block the river if there is flooding, and what happened, it's not there any longer. That detritus, the timber, finished up on the weir that was used to generate hydroelectric power for the MEA years ago. Is the Chief Minister aware that we should listen to local people, as well as having some of the consultants, but the local people on the ground, and it's names that have been in the village for many centuries, like the Creers, the Kinraids? They're the people that we should be taking notice of, and they're the people that we haven't been taking notice of.
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. I can't disagree with what the Honourable Member has said, Mr. President. My policy is always to listen to people at the coalface. And I think that will be a lesson that will be learned, but let's see what the independent review comes up with. Thank you, Mr. President.
Honourable Member for Garth, Mrs Kane.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the Chief Minister for visiting Laxey and seeing for himself the devastation, and for his immediate action in setting up the task force with the 3 departments. But would he agree that there's been a systemic failure over the years since the previous flood in 2015 to action any of the reports that government departments commissioned then? These reports, this government is getting a bit of a reputation, and previous administrations, for getting report after report and not taking action. So are those reports going to form part of this inquiry, and when will people see action? Does he envisage the independent review will be concluding? And in terms of his liaison officer offering reassurance and signposting to other agencies for help, what is government going to do to assist immediately the people most affected? Will there be financial assistance? Will part of that review look at the probability of whether any government agencies were directly responsible for the flooding that affected people, particularly at the higher end?
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, obviously, when I went out there, and I thank the residents and the honourable members for the area, Mr. Perkins and Mrs Kane, who came with me, and Dr Allinson and Minister Harmer, who came with me. We put action straight away, and that was my #1 concern, was A, making sure that we cleared the river that day, and I authorised the removal of the sluice gates on top of the weir, and I then had a meeting where I insisted that we straight away put into action work to ensure that, should the rain come, because at the time we had concerns that there was potentially heavy rain in the next couple of days, we made sure that the banks were shored up and all the river valleys which feed into the Laxey, Old Laxey, were cleared. But on top of that, work to replace the damaged wall on the Glen Road has already started. A design has been prepared for a wall that is capable of holding back the river. The existing wall is old and showing signs of distress, and was not designed to withstand holding back the river. It was purely a highway road made up of stone and mortar. Construction of the replacement is due to begin early next week, if not earlier. The replacement wall will be clad in keeping with the look of the area, Mr. President. So that work is being actioned straight away to ensure, that was my priority, that the residents in that area had this new wall built and that work was done in the interim period. That has been the #1 priority. Now it's about longer term, ensuring that we come up with the strategy, working together with those 3 agencies to make sure that river valleys are inspected on a regular basis, and that whatever work needs to be done in Laxey is delivered, and that's what obviously I will be having the independent review carried out looking into as well.
Honourable Member for Onken, Mr Callister.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the Chief Minister for his statements this morning and his supplementary answers. I hope when the inquiry looks at this, they actually look at two parts, not just one. I genuinely believe that there is two problems here. The one is the flood defences that Laxey actually will need going into the future. But I also feel that inquiry also has to look at the events around the wall. Why was the wall breached in October? As far as I understand, a lot of the properties on the left-hand side of Glen Road in Laxey have never flooded previously, so that has to be looked at. But in respect of a question this morning, I would like to ask the Chief Minister what the government is doing with regard to housing people that are affected. I'm hearing stories that some people are having to vacate properties in that area for up to several months whilst the properties dry out and get refurbished. So what help is government actually offering to those residents that actually need to be housed today whilst those properties are drying out and to be refurbished?
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I said earlier, Mr. President, we have appointed a community officer to meet with the people who are affected. Obviously, the norm is you let your insurance company deal with that side of things, and then it's sorted out at a later date, the responsibilities, etc. So most people are insured. If there's anyone who has a problem, then they should contact the community officer who is visiting the properties to see how the residents are faring, and they can then be put into contact with the relevant agency to help them.
Honourable Member for Onchan, Miss Edge.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to ask the Chief Minister with regards to what was really a catastrophic failure on a number of government departments, it seems. And he's just stated that the wall is getting replaced. The wall was actually knocked down by government officers, departments, in two places. One, where the digger was in the river, and then it was subsequently, speaking to people down in Laxey, another part of the wall was then knocked down further down the river on the actual day. I'm pleased that the Chief Minister is going to do an independent report into this, and it does need to be completely independent. But I'd like to ask him, has he already got a scope for that report? And if not, when he does have, can he share that with all honourable members? And will that scope, will there be a separate independent report done with regards to the government departments? And we've had recommendations 4 years ago for Laxey, and I'm aware of comments on the radio that were made that stated we've been working on this for 4 years. That clearly is totally unacceptable. And will the Chief Minister be doing an independent investigation into why this has taken so long, and we've got this dreadful situation in Laxey for the people? And I assume an independent check, or certainly the Chief Secretary will need to be involved, as numerous departments and numerous reports and recommendations perhaps haven't been carried out. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chief Minister.
Right, Mr. I think there was 3 points to the honourable member for Onchan's from her question. If I'm correct, the first is regarding the wall. First and foremost, obviously, it's well documented, and I'm led to believe by officers that on the 29th of July, a wall wide enough to allow an excavator to go into the stream was put in further up to allow a salmon, not catchment area, but to allow them to migrate up the stream. This should have started slightly early, but high rains in that month meant they couldn't start. Lower down, the river actually burst the wall just above the weir, and as a result of the water coming into that area, officers, people on the site then made a hole in the wall lower down to let that water go back into the stream rather than carry on down the road. So that's the order of events as I've obviously I wasn't there at the time, but that's what I've been led to believe. Obviously, as I've stated to members earlier, the terms of reference for the review will be shared with this honourable court, and obviously I will ask them to look into why we got ourselves where we are and why it took so long for the work to happen.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to follow up on some of the questions from members from Garth and the last point made by the Chief Minister, will the Chief Minister give a commitment to include in the terms of reference to the independent review a look back at actions taken, a look at warnings not heeded, a look at the accountability mechanisms that should have been and whether they were put into place? And would he also give a guarantee that any recommendations that come out of this will be allowed and will be admissible in the Eastern Area Plan process to make sure that that is factored in? We don't end up closing one stable door after that planning horse has bolted.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I cannot see any reason why what the honourable member is, Mr. Speaker, is requesting wouldn't be actioned. Obviously, we want to learn from this. We want to see what we can do to improve the situation. This has happened in Laxey, but it could have happened anywhere. And I think, whilst it has been a severe downpour, over 3 times the norm or what the rest of the island got, we need to learn if this was to happen elsewhere, what can we do better and what can we do to reduce. We're never going to be able to stop events from happening on the island, but what can we do to reduce, to mitigate this happening again?
Honourable Member for Douglas East, Mr. Robert Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. President. I pose my questions as a member of the Environment and Infrastructure Policy Review Committee, who obviously have a very close interest in this whole matter. I have 2 questions. My first question is, would the Chief Minister be kind enough to circulate as soon as possible the detailed remit that he's going to place before the independent review that he's commissioning, so that our Policy Review Committee can decide what role it should or should not play in addition to or outside that remit? And the second question that I pose is, as a member of the committee, I, like many other members, went down to familiarise myself with what had happened in Laxey. And the question I posed to the Chief Minister is, I'm sure he's aware of this, but I'd seek his reassurance that he is he's determined that there should be attention to it, that the discussion and the questions posed this morning relate specifically to the river, but he will be aware, I'm sure, that the properties immediately upstream from the bridge and to the north side of the river have all, one way or another, over the years, spent a lot of money to protect themselves from the river. They were actually flooded from the back, down the back road, and that was not in any way directly associated with the river. And that caused enormous damage and terrible stress for these people, having spent the money that they've spent. So can he reassure me this morning that he's aware of that flooding that took place in the car park behind those properties, and is he determined that early action must be taken to change the camber on the road so that the water flows straight down and not into the back of these properties? Thank you, Mr. President.
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. And in answer to the Honourable Member for Douglas East's first question, the answer is an obvious yes. I'm happy to share with his committee and work together. You know, we've got to learn from this and go forward. And the second, yes, I was aware of secondary flooding coming off the hills rather than from the stream. I did hear of a couple of houses in that region. If it was as a result of the camber of the road need to be changed, then that's something I wasn't aware of. So I'm more than happy to look into that to see what can be done. But I would reiterate on honourable members, flooding off the hills with the amount of looks to be declared the highest rainfall in one area in our history of recorded since we've been recording in 1945. So we can do a lot of things, but we can't stop it from happening. But anything that's obvious and logical, of course, we're going to look at to see what can be done, and I'm happy to work with his committee in any way forward. I promised when I met the residents that I would do my best and make sure things were actioned straight away, and within hours of that promise I had the sluice gates removed and all the timber removed and diggers in clearing out the silt that had been carried down. As I mentioned, 600 tonne in total has been now taken out. But and it's important that this review is independent and fair and that we do look at everything.
Honourable Member for Council, Mrs Sharp.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was in Laxey on the day of the flood. I live there, so I went down to the Glen Road to see what was happening and witnessed the initial devastation with my own eyes. I spoke to one resident who told me that she had had a meeting at her house the week before the flood with representatives of Manx Utilities because she had been so worried about the build-up of debris on the old weir. And this meeting was the result of a long exchange of emails that had been going on for a very long time, and she was extremely angry and upset because her house had been flooded. She lives right by the weir. I spoke to another resident who had questioned Manx Utilities as to... and I am getting to the question, Mr President, excuse me, but I spoke to another resident who'd questioned Manx Utilities as to why there was a hole in the wall at this time of year, and they said that they were behind with their work because the river levels were so high. So one question to the Chief Minister is, why didn't this raise alarm bells? And also I spoke to a Manx Utilities representative about the hole, who told me that the hole couldn't have been involved with the flood because there had been a barrier placed there. And one of the residents pointed out the barrier to me, and it was a mesh barrier, the kind that you would put in front of a building site, which said no entry. It was not a flood barrier. So I would like to ask the Chief Minister, would he not agree that there has been an inexcusable lack of joined-up thinking between the DOI and Manx Utilities? Thank you.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. I can't speculate on what was said and wasn't said. I think it's important that we do get this evidence, and this evidence from your constituent is given to the person appointed to carry out the independent review so they can have a look at it. I was led to believe that the contractor did put a flood defence across the whole based on the rainfall predictions of 30 millimetres for the area. Obviously, I wasn't there. I didn't see it being placed across. It may well have been okay for the 30 mil predicted, but 110 mil was received, which hadn't been predicted. And I think these are topics that are obviously going to have to be investigated by the independent reviewer to get to the bottom of it. But it is disappointing to hear that the problem had been pointed out to our agencies and it hadn't been actioned. But obviously I'll look into that when the Honourable Member for Council, Mr Sharp, can share the information with me. I'll make sure it's passed on to the independent reviewer. Thank you, Mr President.
I have a number of other supplementary questions, so if we could keep them to the point. Mrs Kane.
Thank you, Mr President. While it's to be welcomed that there will be an independent review, will the Chief Minister give an assurance that where government was responsible or is found to be responsible as a result of that review, that the government will compensate residents who were affected? Is he aware that at least one of those householders is uninsured and a further one affected by the runoff from the roads from increasing development along the main coast road, and also the larger runoffs of large properties going up Balaric is thought to have caused the additional runoff through Minorca Hill, plus flooding on the football field. So it is a three-stage set of flood defences and management that needs to be put in place. But where government has failed to take action, what comfort can he give to residents that that will be considered as part of the review? And also, where one resident, as the Honourable Member for Douglas East said, has put £30,000 worth of flood defences in that protected the property from the river, it was government's road drainage that failed and pushed water through the back of businesses, into the back of businesses, into the properties, into the pub, and that they had to be pumped out. When is that going to be addressed, considering we're at the start of the winter season and more rain is forecast?
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. Well, first and foremost, I can say we can't prejudge what this independent report is going to state. So if it finds responsible, then so be it. We will address that. But we can't prejudge what's going to come. Obviously, if all the drains were inspected the week before by the commissioners and by DOI as well, so is it? We'll have to find out, was the road flooding just a case of 110 mils, the heaviest recorded in our history, or is it something that could have been averted? I think we'll have to see what the report says, Mr. President.
Honourable Member for Onken Message.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Chief Minister's commented, I think at least twice, with regards to 600 tonne of silt in the river. Does this therefore indicate, and could the Chief Minister obviously, perhaps there's lack of maintenance, and is the budget not getting spent in the appropriate areas, or is it that we haven't got enough frontline staff?
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was led to believe that the 600 tonne had been washed down in the storm, and that's what had been dug out. Obviously, if that evidence is any different, I will obviously let honourable members know, but that was under the impression, the sheer volume of the water, and we only have to watch the videos of that water coming down either the stream or through various holes to see the force, and that will have carried an awful lot of hardcore gravel and deposited in the river. So that is something. Obviously, we'll have to look at resources for the tree clearing in the future and trying to reduce the capacity for this to happen in the future, Mr. President.
Honourable Member for Douglas South, Mrs. Beecroft.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Chief Minister has said a few times this morning that he wants to learn from this dreadful incident. Can I suggest and ask him if he would agree with me that actually one lesson that could have been learned already is to action recommendations in previous reports? And would you not further agree with me that if recommendations are actioned, it is actually more cost-effective for government and more cost-effective for residents affected, as they both financially and emotionally? Would you not agree with that?
Chief Minister.
Yes, Mr. President, it is important that we do action reports, and I'm led to believe that Laxey Riverbank catchment area was number 12, and 10, 11 had been completed before, so it's next on the line. But obviously we will be looking into, with the independent review, just what did happen and why this hadn't happened earlier, and if it was just bad timing then, but if it wasn't done quickly, then we've got to learn from that. Because yes, obviously I regularly quote Perseus when I was in health. Prevention is better than cure. Anything we can do to prevent this sort of thing, it's not just better for us, but it's better for the people who suffer the impact of flooding. So yes, we will obviously ask this to be reviewed and looked into.
Honourable Member for Middle, Mr. Shimmons.
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is on timescales and development planning. Many residents raised concerns and provided evidence.
No, Honourable Member, I don't want to broaden this out into questions on planning.
I think it is relevant, Mr. President, in terms of timescales.
Focus on what's on the question paper.
I will indeed, but I think there is clearly evidence that was provided to the Eastern Area Plan Inquiry, which was about the increased risk of flooding caused by proposed development in various locations which was higher up than residents' homes. And concreting and tarmacking over the countryside clearly reduces the ability of the land to absorb rainfall. Now, these points tended to be aggressively dismissed at the Eastern Area Plan Inquiry by the QC acting on behalf of the Cabinet Office and also barristers employed by developers. So the question is, when will the independent investigation conclude? Will this be in time for the findings of this important investigation to be made available to the Inquiry Inspector and also the Cabinet Office, which is tasked with bringing forward the Eastern Area Plan? Thank you.
Minister. There may be a question of sub judice when there are ongoing matters, but Chief Minister, taking that into account, You may wish to respond.
Thank you, Mr. President. Obviously, I've instructed the Chief Secretary to set this review up as a matter of urgency, and I can't say how long it's going to take. It would be wrong of me to try and guess, but I expect it to be done as quickly as is humanly possible, and I will have it shared with all members of this court and with the Eastern Area Plan Inspector.
Honourable Member for Council, Mrs Mascot.
Thank you, Mr. President. I share the sentiments and the words expressed today, sympathising with the residents of Laxey Valley, some of whom I know, and your home is the most precious thing, the biggest investment. The question I would ask the Chief Minister is, I can remember during my lifetime that the matter of clearing ditches and the upper reaches of rivers and streams and watercourses and maintaining those, not just rivers but things like ditches along the mountain road, the Len Trench itself, the upper reaches of rivers, they were dealt with by regional gangs, people who knew the area and habitually had a responsibility to keep those cleared. And I wonder if, as part of the terms of reference for this inquiry, should we be considering reverting to that regional approach so that we don't have a workforce coming to the site that maybe doesn't know that river course or that floodplain intimately? That would be my first question. Given that we are told these instances are going to be recurring probably at a much more frequent rate, I'm afraid, and I remember hearing that 30 years ago, if this had happened when there was an astronomically high tide and water couldn't get out, heaven only knows how much worse it might have been. Will we be also looking at the upper reaches across the island of other rivers? Because this, unfortunately, this hit the eastern coast. It can come in any direction, and I would ask that as part of the ongoing decisions made and the recommendations that come out of this inquiry, we look at a strategy that looks at ensuring we keep the upper reaches and trees falling into the river that might get washed down. Could we not really, we need to have some kind of strategy in place to avoid this happening in the future. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, I think it's important that we do the checks, and that's part of the review, and a plan that I've asked for from the three agencies, the MUA, the DOI and DEFRA, to come up with a strategy going forward on how we do regularly inspect our river courses. Obviously, some areas of ditch cleaning now is the responsibility of the local authorities who do have that local knowledge of where the ditches, drains, gullies are in their area. And as I say, to be fair, Laxey commissioners and Garth did inspect the gullies the week before this event took place. We are talking about absolute torrential downpour, the like that the island has never experienced before, or certainly not in living memory. But we will be looking at all areas of the island, and, you know, for example, other rivers identified as a risk of flooding in the future. The key ones are the River Glass and Dew, plus their river middle confluence, as well as the Silverburn, Balaff and Sulby. And all these will be checked and work proposed to make sure we can mitigate, reduce the risk going forward.
Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mr Thomas. Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr President. It's only a very quick question for the Chief Minister. He mentioned that Laxey was number 12 on the list and that numbers 1 to 11 had been done. Number 1, of course, was Ramsey Quayside. I'm not aware that there's been any significant flood defence work being done along the harbour, along the quayside. And Ramsey, in fact, at a meeting with the Commissioners yesterday, they even asked us when that plan was proceeding, when the work was going to be done. So I'd just like the Chief Minister to go away and double-check that those areas 1 to 11 have actually been done and the work has been completed. And perhaps if you could share that with honourable members, that would be very much appreciated.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. I'm more than happy. I can only, my briefings have been incredible in these last few days, and if I have inadvertently misled members or had misleading information, I can only apologise. I will get an update of what has been actioned in the items up to 12 for this honourable court.
Honourable Member for Garth, Mrs Kane.
Thank you, Mr President. The Chief Minister said that the inspections of the drains had been undertaken by the Commissioners, but is he aware that the main road is the responsibility of the Department for Infrastructure, and actually the Corony flooding, and also by the rest, and be thankful, the local people are telling us that's directly as a result of a lack of inspection over many, many years, and that the drains were not cleared even before the rain started, even though it had been forecast. And my other question is, what comfort or reassurance will he give to people that the review of the flooding, will it extend to the main road and other parts of Garth? And also, as a result of that review, will there be any comfort that the people who now no longer can get insurance for their properties will be able to get insurance in the future, because the flood defence strategy that the Chief Minister has assured us is going to come in for Laxey will be undertaken and will be effective?
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, obviously we'll be looking, if there was flooding in Laxey, we need to look at all areas, but the main area was as a result of the river bursting its banks on Old Laxey Road. I've obviously had a letter from, I think I've mentioned in the press release, I've been in contact with the insurance companies, and we will of course be discussing the government's plans to put significant improvements in the area, and I would sincerely hope that that will help with insurance going forward for those houses. But let's see what the independent review comes up with first.
Final supplementary question, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think the final time for talking is now finished, and I'm heartened by the Chief Minister's action plan that we're going to come up with. We must make sure, in fairness to the population of Laxey, that we do put these things into place, and the checks and balances are there to ensure that all this goodwill that we've got at the moment is continued, and we do protect them. If this was a terrorist threat, which I believe global warming is probably more, so the risk is higher to the people, we would have security all over the place. So let's please put these things in place, make sure they're adhered to, have an action plan, and go forward on that basis. Thank you, Mr. President.